In this video, you're going to convert a simple form like this one to a flexible form like this one. So the final form is going to respond to any changes that's happened to the width of your browser. And you can see how the components inside this form are fully flexible. So for example, the comments will show on the right hand side on a big screen, while if you reduce the width, they will show at the bottom of that section. Okay. Also, you can see that the submit button is actually sticking to the bottom of the screen all the time. And that's something you can do very easily using Flexbox. So let's go ahead and build this beautiful layout using Flexbox. To start, you can download the starting source code, which is going to be attached to this lecture. And then you can start making changes to that code to reach the final layout. So let's understand how this layout works. So if I reduce the width of the browser, I can see that changes are going to start happening inside that container, since the comments go below this section. So it looks like these elements are inside one Flexbox, because changes that happen to them exclude any changes happening to the submit button. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one div where I'm going to place all these elements, and another div where I'm going to place that submit button inside the form. And then you will see how to make that submit button stick to the bottom of the browser all the time. So let's go to our HTML file and start making changes. So to make things easy, what I'm going to do, I'm going to build the layout from scratch. Then I'm going to place the different elements inside the right sections. So this means that I'm going to comment the content inside the form, and then I'm going to place new items inside the form. So the idea is to make the form itself a Flexbox. And then this section will go inside the Flexbox as a flex item. And the same thing will happen to the submit button, which will go inside a flex item as well. So let's go ahead and do this. Now, before going any further, I'm going to set the width of the viewports to the device width, since we are building a responsive layout here. So I'm going to do that by adding a meta element, which is going to be a viewport. And I'm going to set its content to width equal to the device width. And also I'm going to set the initial scale to 1. All right. Now I'm going to need to create a CSS file where I'm going to place all the styling. I'm going to link the HTML file to the CSS file by adding a link element, which is going to have a relationship of style sheets. So the type is a text /CSS, and the location of our file is styling.css. Okay, perfect. So for now, I'm going to create a couple of divs. So one div with a class container, for example, and another one with a class submit. So inside the container, you're going to have those elements, including the comments, and we'll see how to lay them out later on. And then inside the submit div, we're going to place the submit button. Okay, so for now, let's just give these divs a background color so that we can see them clearly on our web page. So let's select the container and give it a background color, green yellow, for example. And then let's select the submit div and give it a background color of dark red, for example. Okay, so at the moment we don't see anything because our divs don't have any dimensions, they're empty. So I'm going to add some content there. So let's add a letter inside each div, A and B, and now we can see our divs there. Now we want to make these divs flexible inside a flexbox. So they're going to be flex items inside a flexbox. So the flexbox is going to be the form itself. So we will need to go to the form and set its display property to flex. So now we've got a flexbox and flex items inside it. Now later on, to make things easy when dealing with dimensions, we will need to set the box sizing property of all elements to border box, so that the dimensions of all divs and all boxes include any padding inside these elements. Also, I'm going to remove any margins or paddings that may be there for the body and the HTML components. So I'm going to set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0 as well. All right, so that's our form, and we set the display property to flex. So that's a flex box now. Now, if you look at the final layout, you can see that the direction of the flex box is going to be a column here, because we've got that section at the top and the submit button at the bottom. So I'm going to set the flex direction to column. And here we go. That's the change that we get, since elements are going to be stacked one on top of the other if you set the flex direction to column. All right. Now, if you look at the final layout, you will see that the form itself always occupies the full height of the web page. And to do this, we're going to need to set the height property to the full height of the web page. So to do this, we're going to use the vertical height unit. So if you set that to 100, it means that you're going to be taking the full height of the web page. Okay. If you set that to 50, then you're going to be taking half the height of the web page. So you can't see it very clear here because we don't have enough content. But for now, let's just set that to 100 and then move to the next steps. You can also see that we've got some space there, which separates the inner elements from the border of the form. And we can easily do that by adding some padding, which I'm going to set for now to 10 pixels. We can change this later on. So now let's make sure that this div always sticks to the bottom of the web browser. So how are we going to do this? Well, there is a trick in Flexbox. If you set the margin of one element to auto, and you need to set that into one direction. So for example, if you set the margin of this div, margin top, to auto, then any space that is before that element is going to be fully occupied by that margin, as if there is a flex item before B, or an empty flex item before this div B. So let's see how this happens. So I'm going to set margin top to auto, and now you can see that B has been pushed to the bottom of the form, and any remaining space inside the flexbox has been fully occupied by this margin. And by the way, this is a trick which you can use in any direction of your flexbox. So for example, if we had A and B in a row direction, by setting the margin left of B to auto, then B was going to be pushed all the way to the right of your flexbox, and this margin was going to occupy any remaining space inside the flexbox or inside the row. All right, so that's a really good trick to remember. So for now, let's go back to the column direction, and we're using the margin top to push B to the bottom of the flexbox. All right, now let's have a look at the content of this div and see how it behaves in the final layout. So if I reduce the width of the browser, you can see that the comments go below that section. So first, we will need to divide this element or this container to two sections. One section where we're going to have the address, payments, etc. And then one section where we're going to have the comments. And then obviously this is going to be a flexbox, and these are going to be flex items. So let's go ahead and do this. So inside the container div, let's have a couple of divs. So let's give the first div a class details, for example, and the second one a class comments. So we're going to make this container a flexbox. So you're going to give it a display property set to flex. So the direction is the row direction, which is the default one, so we don't need to set it. But if you want to, you can do that just for clarity. So flex direction row. And let's add some content inside these divs. So A, A1, and A2, for example. So let's see how it looks. Perfect. Now let's add some background color to each of these divs. So let's remove the background color of the container, and then go to those divs. And give them a background color. All right, now let's see how we're going to control the size of these two divs. So if I look at the layouts in a big screen, I can see that these elements actually occupy the full width of the container. And once I reduce the width, then it looks like they are actually wrapped by creating a new line inside the flexbox. So what's happening here is that in a big screen, the comments occupy roughly 1/4 of the full width of the container, while the remaining elements occupy 3/4. And once we reduce the width to the point where we can't squeeze this section anymore, then the flexbox wraps its elements into 2 rows instead of 1 row. All right. So what's happening here is that the container has got a flex wrap property set to wrap, and also the details and comments, they have a flex property which is set to something like 3 for the details and 1 for the comments, since that one occupies 3/4 of the container's width and that one occupies 1/4. So let's have a look at how our web page has become. So the comments div occupies 1/4 of the width, while the other div occupies 3/4. And just to make things even easier, let's change the text inside these divs. To something like this, so that we can see what they refer to in the final layout. Now, if I reduce the width of the container, we don't have a new line because the content is too small anyway. So let's add more content and see what happens. So this time, if I reduce the width, then at some point we've got a new row being created. Now that we have created the overall layout, let's start diving into the individual items and see what's happening inside them. So first, let's dive into the details div and see what components are inside. So the first thing that you will see there is the address details, which is made of labels and inputs. And if I reduce the width of the screen, you can always see that this is actually distributed in the following way. This section takes 1/4 of the width, and thus input takes 3/4 of the width of your element. So basically what's happening here is that each of these combinations of label, a label and an input is actually a flexbox. And inside this flexbox, the first flex item occupies 1/4 of the width of the row inside the flexbox, and the text is actually pushed to the right of that flex item. And the same thing is happening with the next one and the next one. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a div, and inside this div, we're going to have a few divs. Each div is going to be a flexbox, and we will distribute the width of that flexbox between the label and the input. And that's what we're going to do in the next video.